This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The winter of 1867 descended upon Spotsylvania County, Virginia, with a silence that felt unnatural to those who had lived through the war. It was not the absence of sound that troubled the residents, but rather the quality of that silence, a heaviness that seemed to press against windows and doors, as though the air itself remembered what had occurred on these bloodied fields. The conflict had ended 2 years prior, but certain places bore marks that transcended the physical damage of battle. The Riverside Estate was one such place. Located 3 miles west of the county seat, the property could only be reached by a deteriorating carriage road that wound through dense pine forest. The main house, constructed in 1842 by tobacco merchant Silas Riverside, was a 3-story structure of red brick and white-painted wood, featuring the columned facade typical of prosperous Virginia estates of that era. During the final months of the war, the house had been commandeered by the Union Medical Corps and converted into a field hospital. Records preserved at the Spotsylvania County Courthouse document that between March and April of 1865, the facility processed 247 wounded soldiers. 112 of those men died within the estate's walls. The transformation of a private residence into a medical facility had been brutal and hasty. Furniture was removed or destroyed to make space for cots and surgical tables. The elegant parlors where the Riverside family had once entertained guests became wards filled with the wounded and dying. The formal dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and imported wallpaper, became the primary surgical theater. The basement, originally designed as cold storage for food and wine, was repurposed as a morgue when the rate of death exceeded the capacity to bury the dead immediately. Major Atticus Drummond, a surgeon from Massachusetts with a reputation for skill and composure under pressure, commanded the medical operations. He had served since the war's beginning, working in field hospitals from Antietam to Petersburg, but his assignment to Riverside would be his last. Drummond's official reports, preserved in the National Archives, are models of medical documentation, precise, dispassionate, focused on treatments administered and outcomes observed. However, a parallel set of writings, discovered decades later, reveals a different narrative entirely. By late 1865, after the hospital had been closed and the Union forces withdrawn, local residents began to notice peculiarities about the empty estate. Families who lived along the carriage road reported unusual sounds emanating from the property during nighttime hours. Not the expected creaking of an abandoned structure, but something more deliberate. Several witnesses described hearing what seemed to be footsteps moving through the upper floors, always following the same path, always ceasing at the same location. Virgil Harmon, a farmer whose property bordered the estate's western edge, recorded his observations in a journal that would later be donated to the Virginia Historical Society. His entry from November 12, 1865, reads, "Passed by the old hospital place this evening while checking fence lines. The sun was near setting, and I intended to complete my circuit before full dark. As I approached the rear of the property, I observed movement in one of the upper windows, the corner room that I know served as the main surgery. The movement was not rapid or furtive, as one might expect from trespassers or vagrants seeking shelter. Rather, it appeared to be someone walking back and forth with measured, deliberate steps. I watched for perhaps 5 minutes, and the pattern never varied. When the sun dropped below the tree line and darkness came on, I left quickly. I have no explanation for what I saw, as the house has been secured by the county and no one should have been inside." The estate remained unoccupied through the winter of 1865 and into the following year. The county took possession of the property when no heirs to the Riverside family came forward. Silas Riverside had died in 1859, and his two sons had both perished during the war, one fighting for the Confederacy at Gettysburg, the other dying of fever in a Union camp in Tennessee. Various proposals were made regarding the property's use, but none came to fruition. The county commissioners seemed content to leave the matter unresolved, and the estate remained empty. In October of 1866, Cornelius Ashford learned of the property through a land agent in Richmond. Ashford was a textile merchant from Pennsylvania who had prospered during the war years through military contracts. At 43 years of age, he was looking to expand his investments into southern real estate, which could be acquired at dramatically reduced prices. The Riverside estate, with its substantial acreage and solid construction, appeared to be precisely the opportunity he sought. The price was remarkably low, less than a quarter of what such a property would have commanded before the war. The land agent, a Mr. Thaddeus Cooper, was eager to facilitate the sale. His correspondence with Ashford, preserved in the Ashford family papers at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, makes no mention of the property's wartime use or its current reputation among locals. The description focuses entirely on the practical aspects: square footage, number of rooms, condition of outbuildings, quality of land for potential agricultural use. There is no indication that Cooper deliberately withheld information, though later testimony would suggest he was aware of the property's history. Ashford traveled to Spotsylvania County in early November to inspect the property personally. His initial impressions, recorded in a letter to his wife, Lenora, were favorable. The house is larger and more substantial than I had anticipated from Cooper's descriptions. The structure appears sound, though there has been damage from its military occupation that will require attention. Windows have been broken, interior walls bear marks and stains, and much of the original fixtures have been removed or destroyed. However, the foundation is solid, the roof intact, and with proper renovation, I believe this property could serve admirably as both a residence and an investment. The land itself is excellent, cleared fields suitable for cultivation, good timber in the forested sections, and a creek that runs year-round. I have authorized Cooper to proceed with the purchase. The transaction was completed in late November of 1866. Ashford immediately contracted with local builders to begin renovation work. The project's supervisor, a carpenter named Josiah Webb, assembled a crew of 8 men, a mix of local residents and itinerant workers seeking employment in the recovering region. Webb's account ledger, which survived among his descendants' papers, documents the renovation in careful detail. The work began on December 1, 1866. The first week proceeded normally, with crews focusing on exterior repairs, replacing broken window glass, repairing damaged siding, clearing accumulated debris from the grounds. However, on December 8th, an incident occurred that would set the tone for the entire project. 3 workers who had been assigned to clean and prepare the basement for use as storage refused to continue working in that space. When questioned by Webb, they were reluctant to provide specifics, saying only that the area made them uncomfortable and they would prefer assignment to other tasks. Webb himself descended to the basement to assess the situation. His ledger entry for that day reads, "Inspected basement storage area after workers expressed unwillingness to labor there. The space is extensive, running beneath the entire south wing of the house, with ceiling height of approximately 7 feet. The walls are brick, the floor packed earth. The area shows signs of its recent use as a morgue, staining on the floor in several locations, residual odor, despite months of exposure to air. More notable is the temperature. Despite the moderate weather and the lack of wind, the basement maintains a chill that seems disproportionate to its construction and ventilation. Of perhaps greater concern are marks on the walls, scratches and gouges that appear deliberate rather than incidental. Some reach heights that would require a man to be standing on something to make them, yet there are no implements in the space that could have been used for this purpose. I have assigned other workers to the basement, but We'll monitor the situation. Over the following weeks, the renovation proceeded with increasing difficulty. Workers began requesting reassignment away from certain areas of the house, particularly the second-floor corner room that had served as the primary surgical theater and the basement. The complaints were vague but consistent. Feelings of being watched, unexplained cold spots, sounds that seemed to originate from within the walls, rather than from any identifiable source. On January 3, 1867, the entire work crew departed the site midday and did not return. Webb's ledger offers minimal explanation. All workers have refused to continue. No amount of increased wage will persuade them to remain. Project suspended pending ability to assemble new crew. Attached to this entry is a brief statement signed by 6 of the 8 workers. We, the undersigned, hereby resign our employment at the Riverside property, effective immediately. We are willing to forfeit wages owed rather than continue work at this location. We cannot in good conscience recommend that any person occupy this house. Ashford, receiving news of this development at his residence in Pennsylvania, was frustrated but not deterred. He attributed the workers' departure to superstition and the general disruption of normal life in the post-war South. He authorized Webb to hire replacement workers at increased wages and traveled south himself in mid-January to oversee the project's completion personally. It was during this January visit that Ashford first spent a night in the estate. He had taken up temporary residence in one of the ground-floor rooms that had been rendered habitable. His journal entry from January 18, 1867, preserved among his business papers, describes his first night. Retired at approximately 10 o'clock, fatigued from a day of coordinating repair work. The house was quiet, as expected given its emptiness and isolation. I was awakened some time later, I did not note the exact hour, by sounds from the floor above. Distinct footsteps moving along the second-floor hallway, proceeding from the staircase to the far end of the corridor. The steps were measured and unhurried, suggesting someone walking with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly. I assumed Webb had returned to the property for some forgotten item, though it seemed unusual that he would do so at such an hour. I called out but received no response. The footsteps continued for perhaps 2 minutes, then ceased. I heard a door close, the distinctive sound of a latch engaging. In the morning, I mentioned this to Webb, who confirmed he had not been on the property during the night. All doors on the second floor were secured as he had left them the previous evening. I cannot account for what I heard. Despite this experience, Ashford continued with his plans. By late January, sufficient repairs had been completed to make the house marginally habitable. Ashford returned to Pennsylvania to collect his wife and household staff, intending to take up residence in early February. Lenora Ashford, 31 years old, and in delicate health following the loss of an infant son several years earlier, had been reluctant about the move from the beginning. Her letters to her sister Martha reveal her apprehensions. Cornelius is determined to establish himself in Virginia, believing there are fortunes to be made in the rebuilding of the South. I trust his business judgment, but I confess to considerable unease about leaving Pennsylvania for a place where we are unknown, and I suspect not particularly welcome. His descriptions of the house do nothing to ease my concerns. A former hospital damaged by war, isolated from town. He assures me it will be made comfortable, but I cannot shake a sense of foreboding. The Ashford household departed Pennsylvania on February 2, 1867. In addition to Cornelius and Lenora, the party included 2 servants, Mrs. Eleanor Radcliffe, a cook and housekeeper, who had been with the family for 6 years, and Henrik Moss, a groundskeeper and general laborer originally from Sweden. The journey south took 5 days, slowed by poor road conditions and cold weather. They arrived at the Riverside estate on the evening of February 7th. Lenora's first impressions of her new home were not positive. In a letter to Martha dated February 10th, she writes, "We arrived after dark, which perhaps colored my initial perception, but I found the house forbidding. It looms rather than welcomes, and even with lamps lit in several windows, it retained an air of emptiness and resistance. The interior is clean but austere. The renovations have focused on functionality rather than comfort. The rooms are large and cold, with high ceilings that swallow the heat from the fireplaces. The walls bear marks of their recent use that no amount of paint has fully concealed. Stains, scratches, areas where plaster has been patched but remains visible. Cornelius insists I will grow accustomed to it, that once we have furnished it properly and established our routine, it will become home. I am less certain." The household attempted to establish normalcy. Cornelius occupied himself with overseeing final renovation work and beginning to develop business connections in Richmond. Lenora attempted to organize the domestic sphere, working with Mrs. Radcliffe to establish housekeeping routines. Henrik Moss focused on the grounds, which had become overgrown during the property's abandonment. However, within days of the household's establishment, irregularities began to manifest. Mrs. Radcliffe reported to Lenora that kitchen items were being displaced. Utensils and implements found in locations different from where she had left them, always during nighttime hours when the kitchen was unoccupied. She also mentioned recurring difficulties with the basement door, which she claimed would not remain closed despite the latch being engaged. Henrik Moss confided to Cornelius that he had observed movement in upper-floor windows while working in the gardens, shadows passing across window panes in rooms he knew to be empty. He also reported sounds from beneath the south wing of the house, where the basement was located, sounds he described as something being dragged across packed earth, always following the same pattern. All was occurring between 3 and 4 in the morning. Cornelius dismissed these reports as the product of imagination and adjustment to a new environment. He was a practical man, disinclined toward superstition, and he interpreted the staff's concerns as the kind of nervousness that naturally arose when living in an unfamiliar place with a recent history of suffering and death. He counseled patience and rationality. Lenora, however, began to experience phenomena she could not easily dismiss. On February 15th, she woke at what her bedside clock indicated was 3:17 in the morning. The room was intensely cold, despite a fire having been laid in the fireplace before retiring. She could see her breath in the air. She lay perfectly still, listening. From the corridor outside her bedroom, she heard footsteps, the same measured, deliberate tread that Cornelius had reported during his January visit. The steps proceeded from the staircase to the end of the hall, where the former surgical theater was located. She heard the distinct sound of a door opening, though she knew that room was kept locked. For several minutes, she heard sounds from within that room, movement, as though someone were walking from one side to another repeatedly. Then, silence. The footsteps returned along the corridor, passing her door, descending the stairs. The cold in the room gradually dissipated. In the morning, Lenora inspected the second-floor corridor. The door to the former surgical theater remained locked, as it had been the previous evening. She mentioned the experience to Cornelius, who attributed it to dreams or the acoustics of the old house, creating illusions of sound. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Lenora would wake at 3:17, always that precise time, to the same sequence of sounds. She began to sleep poorly, anticipating the disturbance. Her letters to Martha during this period show increasing distress. "I am exhausted beyond measure. Sleep has become something I approach with dread rather than relief. Cornelius believes I am suffering from nerves, perhaps a recurrence of the melancholia that afflicted me after we lost our son. He may be correct, but the phenomena I experience feel too consistent, too detailed, to be products of an unbalanced mind. Last night I counted the footsteps, 17 paces from the staircase to the door, a pause, the door opening, movement within the room, then 17 paces returning, always 17. On March 6, Henrik Moss requested release from his employment. He was apologetic but adamant. When pressed for reasons, he eventually revealed that he had ventured into the basement the previous night, unable to account for the sounds he kept hearing from that location. What he found there disturbed him sufficiently that he could no longer remain on the property. He described the basement floor as bearing marks, long grooves worn into the packed earth, all converging on a central point near the far wall. He also claimed to have found scratches on the brick walls, not the scattered marks that might result from moving stored items, but deliberate patterns, repeated sets of 5 lines, clustered in groups of 17. Cornelius examined the basement himself and confirmed the presence of the marks Moss described, though he insisted they were simply remnants of the space's use as a morgue, perhaps indicating where bodies had been stored or where workers had made tallies. He offered Moss increased wages to remain, but the groundskeeper declined. He departed the estate on March 8th, taking employment at a farm near Fredericksburg, where he would remain for the rest of his working life. When interviewed decades later by a historian researching the property, Moss, then elderly and near death, would say only, "Some places are wounded in ways that don't heal. That house was such a place." I have no regrets about leaving. With Moss's departure, the estate's grounds began to deteriorate rapidly. Cornelius attempted to maintain them himself, but his business obligations required frequent travel to Richmond, leaving the property increasingly neglected. The gardens became overgrown, the outbuildings fell into disrepair, and the forest began to encroach on the cleared land. Mrs. Radcliffe lasted only 2 weeks longer than Moss. On March 22nd, she experienced what she would later describe as an encounter that removed all doubt about the nature of that house. She had descended to the basement to retrieve preserved goods stored there. It was mid-morning, with full daylight streaming through the small windows at ground level. As she searched the shelves, she became aware of a presence behind her. She turned to find the space empty, but the feeling persisted and intensified, the absolute certainty that something was standing directly behind her, close enough to touch. The temperature dropped precipitously. Her breath became visible in the air. She heard very distinctly a voice speaking directly beside her ear, so close she could feel the breath that accompanied the words. The voice said something she could not understand, not English, possibly not any human language, more a sequence of sounds that somehow conveyed meaning without words. The meaning she perceived was simple and terrible. "You are marked 17 complete." Mrs. Radcliffe fled the basement immediately and departed the property within the hour, not even collecting her personal belongings or final wages. In a deposition given to county authorities in 1869, during an investigation prompted by later events, she stated, "I am an educated woman, not given to fancies or superstitions. What I experienced in that basement was not imagination. Something resided in that house, something that had been there since the hospital's operation, perhaps longer. I understood in that moment that the house was keeping count of something, and that those who resided there were being incorporated into that count. I had no desire to discover what occurred when the tally was complete." Audacious. Cornelius and Lenora now found themselves alone in the estate, without staff or nearby neighbors, isolated by both distance and the growing reputation of the property. The situation placed considerable strain on their relationship. Cornelius spent increasing amounts of time in Richmond, sometimes remaining there for 10 days at a stretch, conducting business from a boarding house and avoiding return to the estate. Lenora, left alone for extended periods, began to deteriorate both physically and mentally. Her letters to Martha during late March and early April document her decline. "I am alone more than I am accompanied. Cornelius's business requires his presence in Richmond, or so he claims. I suspect the truth is that he cannot bear to be in this house, though he will not admit it even to himself. The sounds continue nightly, the footsteps, the opening door, the movements within that room. I have ceased to report them to Cornelius, as he only suggests I am unwell. Perhaps I am unwell. Certainly I feel myself changing. I sleep during daylight hours, when the house is quieter, and remain awake through the nights. The darkness no longer frightens me as it once did. I have begun to understand that what resides here is not actively malevolent, but rather indifferent. It pursues some purpose of its own, and we are merely incidental to that purpose. This thought should be comforting, but instead I find it terrifying. To be the object of malevolence at least implies significance. To be irrelevant to the force that shares one's home suggests a fundamental powerlessness. On April 3rd, Lenora made a decision that would have irreversible consequences. She had become obsessed with the locked room at the end of the second-floor corridor, the former surgical theater where the footsteps always terminated. She had never entered this room since arriving at the estate. Cornelius kept it locked, and she had respected that boundary. But her curiosity and her need to understand what was occurring in her home overcame her caution. She found a spare key among Cornelius's belongings and, during one of his absences in Richmond, unlocked the door. Her account of what she found, written in her journal and later recovered by investigators, is detailed and disturbing. I entered the room at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the light was strongest. The space had been cleared of medical equipment during the renovation, but the surgical table remained, a massive oak structure, darkly stained, too heavy to have been easily removed. The room was cold, noticeably colder than the corridor, despite a south-facing window that should have admitted warming sunlight. The walls bore marks I had not anticipated. Not the scattered damage of wartime use, but systematic markings, scratches arranged in groups, each group consisting of 5 parallel lines. I counted the groups. There were 17 complete sets on the wall adjacent to the surgical table. But what arrested my attention, what made me understand something fundamental about this place, was what I found carved into the table itself. Names, dozens of them, scratched into the wood with what must have been a sharp instrument. The names were accompanied by dates, all from March and April of 1865. I recognized none of the names, but I understood immediately what they represented: men who had died on that table during the hospital's operation. I counted the names carefully. There were 16, and beside the final name, a space had been prepared for one more, outlined but not filled. Beneath this empty space, someone had carved a single word: Drummond. Major Atticus Drummond had died on April 19, 1865, of septic infection, the official cause recorded in military medical records. His death had occurred within the estate, in the surgical theater where he had worked for the previous 6 weeks. Lenora's discovery suggested something the official records did not contain. Drummond had anticipated his own death and marked his place in the sequence he had been documenting. But there was more. On the wall opposite the table, Lenora found additional markings, these apparently made more recently. The scratches were lighter in color, less weathered. These markings were not names, but symbols she could not interpret, arranged in patterns that suggested intentionality, and written in what appeared to be charcoal, though she could not imagine where charcoal would have come from, a message in English. The count continues beyond 16. 17 to complete the pattern. 17 opens the way. Lenora spent over an hour in that room examining every surface, trying to understand what she had discovered. As the afternoon light began to fade, she became aware of a change in the room's atmosphere. The cold intensified. The quality of the light became strange, as though the approaching dusk was entering the room through the walls rather than the window. She heard sounds beginning elsewhere in the house, footsteps on the first floor, doors opening and closing, movement in the basement. And she understood, with a clarity that transcended rational thought, that by entering this room during daylight hours, by examining what it contained, she had somehow activated or accelerated something that had been developing slowly during the weeks of her residence. She fled the room, locked the door, and retreated to her bedroom, where she remained for the next 36 hours without eating or sleeping, merely sitting by the window watching the grounds and waiting for Cornelius to return from Richmond. When he finally arrived, on the evening of April 5th, he found her in a state of extreme agitation. She told him everything she had discovered in the surgical theater. His response was to dismiss her account as the product of exhaustion and isolation. He accused her of becoming hysterical, of allowing her melancholic temperament to distort perception. The argument that followed was bitter and unresolved. Cornelius departed again for Richmond the following morning, promising to return within 3 days. He did not fulfill that promise. Business matters, he later claimed, required his extended presence in the capital, but testimony from associates in Richmond suggested otherwise. Cornelius had been seen in taverns and gambling establishments, spending money freely and showing no signs of business stress. It appeared he was simply avoiding return to the estate, though he would never admit this directly. Lenora remained alone for 9 days. Her journal entries during this period show progressive deterioration. April 7th. The sounds begin earlier each evening now, shortly after dusk, rather than waiting until after midnight. The footsteps have multiplied. Where before there was one set of measured paces, now there seem to be several, overlapping, all following the same route, but at different intervals. The house has become a transit point for something. I do not know what, but I sense purpose and pattern. April 9th. I descended to the basement again today. I could not explain the compulsion, but I felt drawn there. The marks on the floor have deepened, as though the dragging that created them has continued during my residence. The scratch marks on the walls have increased in number. I counted sets of 17 repeated multiple times across every accessible surface, and in the center of the space where all the floor grooves converge, I found something that was not there during my previous examination. A small pile of personal items, a pocket watch, a pair of spectacles, a tarnished brass button, a letter folded and refolded until the creases have split the paper. These items appear old, consistent with the war period, but they were not present before. They have been brought here, arranged deliberately, offerings or markers. April 11th. I no longer sleep. Sleep seems beside the point. I spend nights walking through the house, following the sounds, trying to understand the pattern. I have come to believe the house is not haunted in the traditional sense. That is too simple an explanation. Rather, the house has become a container for something that was created during its time as a hospital. So much death in such concentrated space, so much suffering, so many lives ending on that table in that room. Some residue remained, some essence or accumulation of all those final moments. And that accumulation has developed intention or purpose, or at the very least, a pattern it is compelled to complete. 17 is significant. 17 names, 17 marks, 17 paces. I do not know why 17, but I understand that the pattern is not yet complete, that something or someone is needed to reach that number and conclude the sequence. April 13th. I found another message today, written in dust on the table in the surgical theater. I had not been in that room since my initial investigation, but I felt compelled to check. The dust had been disturbed deliberately, formed into letters. You are the 17th, complete the pattern. I wiped the message away, but within hours it had reappeared. I wiped it away again. It reappeared again. I have stopped wiping it away. On April 14th, Lenora wrote her final letter to her sister Martha. The letter was found unsealed on the desk in her bedroom. Dearest Martha, by the time you receive this, if you receive it, events here will have reached their conclusion. I wish I could explain more clearly what has occurred, what is occurring, what I understand must occur. This house has become a mechanism for something I lack the vocabulary to properly name. During the war, death saturated these rooms. Not random death, but concentrated medicalized death. Men brought to a specific room, placed on a specific table, worked upon by specific hands, marked with specific names. Major Drummond, I believe, understood something toward the end. He saw the pattern developing. He tried to warn someone, or perhaps he tried to complete something. The 16 names carved into the table represent men who died there, but they also represent something more. A sequence, a count, a progression toward completion. Drummond made himself the 17th name, but he died before he could properly seal the pattern. The pattern remains unsealed, still seeking its 17th component. I have come to understand that this is why the estate cannot be peacefully occupied. It requires completion. It waits for completion, and I have been brought here to provide that completion. This is not suicide, Martha, though it may appear so. This is participation in something larger than my individual existence. I am frightened, but I am also strangely at peace. The house no longer feels hostile. It feels expectant, almost grateful. Cornelius will not understand, but perhaps you will. Tell him I did not suffer at the end. Tell him I chose this, insofar as choice exists in circumstances like these. Tell him to sell the property, to seal the surgical theater permanently, to allow the pattern to remain complete once it has been completed. Do not come here, Martha. Do not attempt to investigate what happened. Trust that I understood what was necessary and that I acted with as much agency as the circumstances permitted. I love you. I loved Cornelius. I loved the son we lost. I hope that whatever exists beyond this life will allow me to rejoin them. If not, I hope at least for peace. Your sister, Lenora. Cornelius Ashford returned to the estate on the morning of April 16th. He had received no communication from Lenora indicating distress, and he had no reason to expect anything unusual. He arrived at mid-morning to find the house quiet. The front door was unlocked. He entered and called for his wife. There was no response. The ground floor appeared normal, cold and empty, but showing no signs of disturbance. He climbed to the second floor and found their bedroom door closed. He knocked and received no answer. He opened the door. The room was in disarray. Furniture had been pushed aside, as though to clear a path from the door to the window. The bedclothes had been stripped from the bed and piled in one corner. On the desk sat Lenora's final letter, weighted down with a small stone, but Lenora herself was not present. Cornelius searched the room, then the entire second floor, calling her name with increasing urgency. He descended to the first floor and searched again. He checked the kitchen, the pantry, the servants' quarters. He went to the basement, though he dreaded entering that space. She was not there. He returned to the second floor and stood in the corridor, uncertain where to look next. Then he noticed something he had missed before. The door to the former surgical theater stood open. He was certain it had been closed and locked when he ascended the stairs. He approached slowly and looked inside. The room was empty of people, but showed signs of recent presence. On the surgical table, arranged carefully, were several items: Lenora's wedding ring, her pearl necklace, a lock of her hair bound with thread, and a small leather journal he recognized as her diary. The dust on the floor showed footprints leading from the door to the table, then from the table to the window. The window stood open, which was strange because he knew it had been painted shut during the renovation and could not easily be moved. Cornelius approached the window and looked out. The drop from the second floor to the ground was approximately 20 feet, ending on a section of flagstone terrace. Lenora's body lay on the terrace, positioned in a way that suggested she had not fallen accidentally, but had stepped deliberately from the window. County coroner's records preserved at the courthouse document that she died instantly from injuries sustained in the fall. The official determination was accidental death due to mental disturbance, though the coroner noted several inconsistencies that troubled him. The window should not have been openable given its painted state. Lenora's body showed no signs of struggle or hesitation, and her expression was described as peaceful rather than fearful. But there was something else, something the coroner mentioned in his private notes but omitted from the official report. On the wall beside the surgical table, someone had added a name to the sequence carved there. The name was Lenora Ashford, dated April 15, 1867. It was the 17th name. The sequence was complete. Cornelius Ashford left the estate immediately following his wife's death. He never returned, not even to collect personal belongings. He sold the property through an agent within weeks, accepting an offer far below market value simply to be rid of it. He returned to Pennsylvania and resumed his business there, but those who knew him reported that he was changed, withdrawn, prone to long silences, unwilling to discuss his time in Virginia. He died in 1873 at age 50 of heart failure. His estate papers included a codicil to his will stating that under no circumstances should his remains be transported to Virginia for burial. He wished to be interred in Pennsylvania, as far from Spotsylvania County as practicable. The Riverside estate remained unoccupied for the next 8 years. The county took possession again when the sale to which Cornelius had agreed fell through. The purchaser visited the property once and immediately withdrew his offer, forfeiting his deposit rather than complete the transaction. Various proposals were made for the property's use, but none gained traction. Local residents avoided the area entirely. The carriage road became overgrown and impassable. The house itself began to deteriorate from lack of maintenance. In 1875, the property was acquired by the county government for use as agricultural equipment storage. Workers were instructed to use only the ground floor and outbuildings. The second floor and basement were to remain untouched. This arrangement functioned adequately for several years, though workers reported unusual experiences. Tools would be rearranged overnight. Doors that had been left open would be found closed in the morning, and occasionally, during late afternoon hours when the sun was low, shadows would move across the second-floor windows in patterns that suggested human figures walking back and forth. In 1879, the county proposed converting the estate into a school. The Regional Education Board enthusiastically supported the plan, as the structure was larger than any existing school building and could accommodate students from several districts. Plans were drawn up, funding was allocated, and renovation was scheduled to begin in the spring of 1880. However, in February of that year, the Board of County Supervisors abruptly canceled the project. The meeting minutes record no discussion of this decision, merely a unanimous vote to withdraw the proposal to convert the Riverside property to educational use. No alternative explanation was provided, and the property reverted to storage use. A curious document survives from this period in the personal papers of Edmund Talbot, who served as county superintendent of schools. In a letter to a colleague in another county dated March 1880, Talbot writes, "You inquired about the school project at the old Riverside Hospital. I am disappointed to report it has been abandoned. The official reason given is budgetary constraints, but I believe the true reason is quite different. Several members of the Board of Supervisors visited the property before voting. What they experienced there they will not discuss publicly, but I gather it was sufficient to convince them that children should not be placed in that building under any circumstances. One supervisor told me privately that he spent 10 minutes in the house and will never return." He described a feeling of being watched from every room simultaneously, and sounds he could not account for. Another mentioned finding the former surgical theater, which had been sealed, standing open with items arranged on the table that no one could explain. I do not believe in haunted houses in the traditional sense, but I cannot deny that something about that property troubles even the most practical and skeptical men. It will not be used as a school. I suspect it will not be used for anything that requires human habitation. The estate's end came on October 12, 1886. A fire broke out during the evening hours, origin undetermined. The volunteer fire brigade from the county seat responded, but arrived to find the structure fully engulfed. The fire marshal's report attributes the blaze to lightning strike, though several witnesses reported that the fire appeared to begin simultaneously in multiple locations within the building. There had been no storm that evening, no electrical activity in the atmosphere. The structure burned through the night, collapsing entirely by dawn. Only the brick foundation and chimneys remained. Interestingly, several witnesses reported seeing figures in the upper floor windows during the fire, silhouettes of people standing motionless as flames surrounded them. The volunteer fire chief, Thomas Brennan, filed a supplementary report noting, "Multiple witnesses reported seeing persons trapped in the burning structure. We attempted rescue operations despite the intensity of the blaze, but upon entering the building as far as safely possible, we found no one. The upper floors were completely engulfed, making survival impossible. Yet the figures in the windows were observed by at least 6 reliable witnesses. They appeared to be standing calmly, not moving or attempting escape, simply observing. As the roof collapsed, the figures vanished. We recovered no human remains from the ruins. I cannot explain what was seen, but I document it for the record." The property lay abandoned for decades following the fire. The ruins were gradually reclaimed by forest. By 1900, little remained visible above ground except the brick foundation and remnants of the chimneys. The county maintained nominal ownership, but made no attempt to clear or develop the site. In 1924, Dr. Raymond Kohler, a historian specializing in Civil War medical practices, became interested in the Riverside estate after encountering references to it in military medical journals. Kohler was particularly intrigued by mentions of experimental procedures conducted at Riverside Hospital during the war's final months, procedures that were documented in official reports but never fully explained. He obtained permission from the county to conduct an archaeological excavation of the site. The excavation began in July of 1924 with a crew of 5 workers and an assistant researcher, Miss Dorothy Halloway, who was completing her doctorate in American history. Kohler's field notes, preserved in his archived papers at the Virginia Historical Society, document 3 weeks of work. The excavation focused on the foundation, attempting to establish the precise layout of the building and recover artifacts that might illuminate the medical practices employed there. During the first week, the team uncovered the basement area. Despite decades of exposure to weather and the intense heat of the 1886 fire, certain features remained remarkably preserved. The team found the brick walls largely intact, though blackened by smoke. The packed earth floor showed the marks that previous witnesses had described, long grooves, worn smooth, all converging toward the far wall. On the walls themselves, the team found extensive scratching, some shallow and old, some deeper and apparently more recent, though how marks could be recent on a structure abandoned for nearly 4 decades puzzled the researchers. Kohler's notes from July 15, 1924. "We have cleared sufficient debris to fully examine the basement. The marks on walls and floor confirm accounts from the 1860s. What is not explained is the freshness of some markings, scratches that show bright brick beneath, suggesting they were made after the fire, which seems impossible. More troubling is the arrangement we found in the center of the space, where all floor grooves meet. Someone has placed items there. Rusted medical instruments, personal effects including pocket watches and spectacles, fragments of uniform cloth. The items are from the Civil War period, but their arrangement is clearly recent. They lie atop fire debris and show no signs of having survived the blaze. Someone has been on this property and arranged these things deliberately, but who and for what purpose? The second week of excavation focused on the former surgical theater, identifiable by its position relative to the rest of the structure. The team uncovered the surgical table, which had survived the fire in remarkable condition. The oak had charred, but not burned through. Carved into its surface were the 17 names that Lenore Ashford had documented in her journal, though Kohler had no access to that journal and did not initially understand the significance of the count. On July 23rd, an incident occurred that would fundamentally alter the excavation. 2 workers, clearing debris from the surgical theater area, claimed to hear sounds emanating from beneath the foundation, rhythmic impacts as though something were striking the underside of the stone. They reported this to Kohler, who investigated personally. He heard nothing initially, but as he stood at the site in late afternoon, he experienced what he described in his notes as a profound sense of wrongness, as though I were standing at the threshold of something that should not be disturbed. That evening, alone at the excavation site while the crew had returned to town, Kohler heard the sounds himself. His notes described them as 17 distinct impacts, evenly spaced, originating from beneath the surgical theater foundation, though no cavity exists there, according to our excavation. The impacts were forceful enough to cause dust to rise from gaps in the stonework. They occurred at precisely 3:17 in the morning. I noted the time because the precision seemed significant. Following the 17th impact, silence. I remained on site until dawn, but the sounds did not recur. Over the following days, 3 workers quit the excavation, citing personal reasons. Miss Halloway began experiencing severe headaches and disturbed sleep. She reported dreams in which she stood in the surgical theater while it was in operation, watching procedures she could not look away from, hearing sounds she could not block out. Kohler himself began to sleep poorly and developed what he described as a persistent sense of being observed, even when alone. On July 29th, the excavation uncovered something that convinced Kohler to abandon the project. Beneath a section of collapsed flooring from the surgical theater, the team found a sealed metal box, roughly 12 inches square. The box was locked and showed no signs of damage from the fire. Kohler forced it open to find a journal, leather-bound, water-damaged, but legible, and a collection of papers. The journal was identified by bookplate as belonging to Major Atticus Drummond. Most entries concerned routine medical matters, treatments administered, supplies needed, observations on various wounds and diseases. But the final entries, dated from April 13th to April 17th, 1865, described circumstances that troubled Kohler deeply. April 15th, 1865. The count stands at 16. I have marked each one on the wall, though I do not fully understand the compulsion to do so. Something has developed here beyond my medical practice. An accumulation, perhaps, or a pattern that demands completion. The men who die on my table, their final moments have weight here. The room has become saturated with those moments. I feel them pressing against me when I work. Not hostile, but present, undeniable. I believe something is being created through this process, something that requires 17 to be complete. Why 17? I cannot answer, but I know with certainty that the count will not stop at 16. April 17th, 1865. I am the 17th. I understand this now. I have fallen ill, the same infection that claimed 3 men last week. The fever is already severe. I will die here, on the table where so many others have died. I have carved my name alongside theirs, the 17th name. Perhaps this will complete what has been developing. Perhaps my death will seal the pattern. I no longer fear dying. What troubles me is the question of what comes after the pattern is complete. What has been created here? What will it do? I have failed to document this properly, failed to warn anyone adequately. If someone reads this after I am gone, understand, 17 deaths in this room have created something that persists beyond those deaths. Whether this persistence is merely memory or something more active I cannot determine. But the room is not empty after death occurs. Something remains. Something accumulates. At 17, perhaps that accumulation reaches critical mass. I die not knowing what that means. The papers in the box included medical sketches, notes on procedures, and several letters Drummond had written but never sent, apparently describing his concerns to colleagues. One letter, addressed to the union medical director but never mailed, warned. The practice of concentrating so many deaths in a single location may have consequences we do not anticipate. I recommend rotation of surgical personnel and distribution of casualties across multiple facilities. The accumulation of mortality in one space creates conditions that affect both staff and patients in ways I cannot adequately explain but nonetheless observe. Wheeler read these documents in his tent that evening. That night, he experienced what he recorded as the most vivid and disturbing dream of my life, if it was indeed a dream. He wrote, "I found myself standing in the surgical theater as it was during the war. Men on cots, the smell overwhelming, sounds of suffering constant. I watched as Major Drummond worked on a patient on the table. The patient died. Drummond marked the wall, a single stroke, and I saw, or believed I saw, something change in the room, not visibly but perceptibly, as though each death added weight to the space, made it denser, more present. I watched as this repeated. Men brought in, worked upon, dying, marked. The accumulation continued, and when the 16th mark was made, I felt the room waiting, expecting, requiring. I woke at 3:17 in the morning, certain I had heard 17 impacts from the direction of the excavation site, though I was camped more than 100 yards away." The following morning, Kohler informed the crew that the excavation was ending immediately. He offered no detailed explanation, citing only concerns about the structural stability of the site. The workers departed relieved. Miss Halloway returned to her university, where she completed her doctorate on a different topic entirely, never writing about the Riverside estate. Kohler himself published nothing about the excavation. However, in a letter to a colleague dated August 10, 1924, Kohler was more forthcoming. "I cannot in good conscience continue work at the Riverside site. What we have uncovered there troubles me in ways I cannot fully articulate to professional peers without risking my reputation. I am a rational man, a scientist, yet I cannot deny what I experienced. The site is not simply an archaeological location. It is something more, a place where circumstances during the war created conditions that persist beyond normal understanding. I believe Major Drummond was correct in his assessment. 17 deaths in that room created an accumulation that remains active in some way. My recommendation to the county will be to permanently seal the site and prohibit further excavation or construction. Some knowledge once gained carries responsibilities I am unwilling to assume." The excavation site was sealed with concrete in September of 1924 at county expense. The official justification was protection of historically significant ruins, though no plans for historical interpretation or public access were ever developed. The property was formally designated as restricted county land, with no development permitted. Over subsequent decades, the restriction remained in place despite periodic proposals to rescind it. In 1947, a developer proposed building a residential subdivision on the site, offering substantial payment to the county for the land. The proposal was rejected by unanimous vote of the Board of Supervisors, with no discussion recorded in the meeting minutes. In 1953, a similar proposal for a commercial development met the same fate. In each case, board members who voted on the matter declined to explain their reasoning publicly. A few residents who were present at these meetings later provided insight. Carl Whitmore, who served on the Board of Supervisors from 1945 to 1960, said in a 1965 interview, "We all knew about that property. Not from personal experience, most of us, but from stories passed down, from records in the courthouse, from the general knowledge that accumulates in a community about certain places. Nobody wanted to be responsible for putting people on that land. It wasn't superstition exactly. It was more practical than that, a recognition that some places are better left alone. That development there would lead to problems we'd rather not deal with. So we kept finding reasons to deny proposals, and eventually people stopped making them. The site remained undisturbed through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The forest reclaimed it completely. Even the concrete seal became obscured by vegetation and accumulated soil. The county continued nominal maintenance, periodic inspections to ensure the seal remained intact, though the reports from these inspections often noted anomalies that inspectors struggled to explain. A 1958 inspection report notes, "Concrete seal shows unusual cracking patterns radiating from center point as though subject to pressure from beneath. This is inconsistent with normal settling or frost heave, which would produce random cracking. Recommend reinforcement, though the source of the pressure is not apparent." Similar reports appear in 1961, 1964, and 1967, each noting the same inexplicable cracking, each recommending the same reinforcement. The most recent event of historical significance occurred in October of 1968. 3 graduate students from the University of Virginia, researching Civil War medical facilities for a documentary project, learned of the Riverside estate through military records. Intrigued by references to experimental procedures and the property's unusual fate, they decided to visit the site and conduct overnight recording, hoping to capture ambient sound and visual material for their documentary. They arrived on the evening of October 12th, coincidentally the anniversary of the 1886 fire. They set up audio recording equipment near the sealed excavation site and a motion picture camera to document the location. Their intention was to remain through the night, conducting periodic recordings and observations. The 3 students were last seen at approximately 11 o'clock that evening by a county sheriff's deputy who happened to patrol the area. The deputy later reported that the students seemed in good spirits, well equipped, and properly prepared for a night outdoors. He saw nothing concerning and continued his patrol. The students departed the site shortly after 3 o'clock in the morning. They abandoned all their equipment, recording devices, cameras, camping gear, even their vehicle, which remained parked on the access road. They walked approximately 6 miles to the nearest residence and requested transportation to town. When asked what had happened, all 3 refused to discuss it, saying only that they would not be completing their documentary and wished to leave the county immediately. The sheriff's department recovered the abandoned equipment the following day. The audio recordings were intact. The tapes covered approximately 4 hours, from 11 in the evening until 3:17 in the morning. For the first 3.5 hours, the recordings captured normal nighttime sounds, wind, insects, occasional animal movement. The students could be heard occasionally speaking, making observations, adjusting equipment. At approximately 3:15, the ambient sounds ceased abruptly. Complete silence, as though someone had muted the environment. Then, at 3:17, a sequence of sounds began, rhythmic impacts coming from the sealed excavation, clear and distinct on the recording. The impacts continued for approximately 30 seconds. 17 individual strikes, evenly spaced. Following the 17th impact, the students could be heard reacting, confused exclamations, then alarm, then what sounded like panic. The recording captured sounds of them hurriedly gathering equipment, then running. The tape ran out shortly after. The motion picture film was developed but showed nothing unusual, only nighttime footage of the forest and the excavation site. However, the film appeared to have been damaged during processing. At precisely the point where the audio recording captured the 17 impacts, the film showed frame after frame of pure white, as though it had been exposed to intense light. The frames immediately preceding and following this section were normal, making the light exposure inexplicable. The three students never publicly discussed what they experienced. Two completed their graduate programs in other fields of study. The third left academia entirely. When contacted by researchers in subsequent years, all three declined to provide details, with one stating simply, "We heard something we could not explain, and we saw something we will not describe. I have no interest in returning to that subject." The audio recording from that night was archived by the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Department. It remains there today, filed as evidence in case number 681012, though what crime or incident it relates to is not specified. Researchers who have obtained permission to listen to the recording confirm the sequence described: normal ambient sound, sudden silence, 17 impacts, panic. The quality of the recording is excellent. The impacts are clear and forceful. Their source appears to be directly beneath the concrete seal, though no cavity exists in that location, according to all architectural and geological surveys. The Riverside Estate site remains sealed and restricted. The most recent county inspection occurred in 1969. The report notes, "Concrete seal requires significant reinforcement. Cracking has progressed to the point where structural integrity is compromised. Cause of deterioration remains unexplained. Recommend complete replacement of seal rather than continued patching. Also recommend permanent markers be installed prohibiting public access, as informal trails suggest occasional trespassing, despite the site's remoteness." The seal was reinforced as recommended, though not replaced. County budget constraints prevented the more extensive work. Signs were installed warning of unstable ground and prohibiting entry. The property remains officially restricted, with no plans for any change in that status. Researchers occasionally inquire about accessing the site or consulting records related to it. Such requests are routinely denied by the county, typically with reference to concerns about site stability and safety. The historical records related to the Riverside Estate, including Lenora Ashford's journal, Dr. Kohler's excavation notes, the 1968 audio recording, and various other documents, are archived, but access is restricted or heavily supervised. In 1969, a historian from the National Archives attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Riverside Estate's history, intending to publish it as part of a larger study of Civil War medical facilities. He was granted limited access to county records and interviewed several elderly residents who had knowledge of the property. His research file grew substantial, but the project was never completed. The historian, Dr. Marcus Wendell, died in 1970 of a heart attack. His research materials were donated to the Virginia Historical Society, but were designated as restricted access for reasons that remain unclear. A note found among Dr. Wendell's papers, written shortly before his death, provides some insight into his decision not to publish. "I have spent 8 months researching the Riverside property, and I have reached a conclusion that will seem unprofessional to my colleagues. This history should not be widely disseminated, not because the facts are uncertain, they are well documented. Not because the events are not historically significant, they illuminate important aspects of Civil War medical practice and post-war social dynamics, but because the story itself seems to carry some quality that affects those who engage with it deeply. Of the previous researchers who investigated this property thoroughly, several died young, several experienced significant personal or professional disruption, and all expressed the view that the investigation should not have been conducted. I do not believe in curses or supernatural influences, but I do believe that some histories, through sheer accumulation of trauma and tragedy, develop a weight that affects those who handle them. This is one such history. I will archive my research for potential future use, but I will not publish it myself." The Riverside Estate remains a footnote in Virginia history, mentioned occasionally in broader studies of Civil War hospitals, noted in property records, remembered vaguely by longtime county residents as That place near the old carriage road. The casual visitor to Spotsylvania County would never know it existed. The forest has claimed it entirely. The concrete seal lies beneath decades of accumulated leaves and soil. The access road has disappeared into the woods, but the restriction remains in place. The site is still designated as off-limits, and every few years when the county engineer inspects the seal, the same observation appears in the report: unexplained cracking radiating from the center, as though something beneath continues to press upward, seeking release or completion or continuation. The engineer patches the cracks, files the report, and recommends continued monitoring. The cycle repeats. Some patterns, once established, persist beyond the lives of those who created them. Some places remember what occurred within them and continue in their own way to mark the passage of time. Whether this persistence is merely the weight of history or something more active is a question each person must answer for themselves. But the county, through its continued restrictions and periodic maintenance of that sealed excavation site, has answered the question implicitly. Better to assume something persists than to risk discovering what might be released. Better to leave certain patterns undisturbed, certain counts incomplete, certain thresholds uncrossed. The Riverside estate stands or lies buried as a reminder that not all questions should be answered, not all histories should be fully documented, and not all places should be revisited. Some silence is not empty, some stillness is not peaceful, and some numbers once counted continue counting themselves.